psyched to have all three of you here. I think maybe just as a setup before we go into introductions, Ann from Super Rare had reached out and wanted to know if I'd be willing to put together a panel to talk specifically about generative art and AI art. And I think we can talk a little bit about whether or not those are two things or whether or not they overlap a little bit. And one of the topics that I thought would be really interesting to cover is sort of artistic process. Like what does that mean and what is that and how does it influence the work that you produce? And my reasoning behind bringing that in as a topic is that there's a lot of folks that I think are fairly new to art that are collecting on Super Rare and a lot of enthusiasm. And to be honest, there's a fair amount of money changing hands. But I think in a lot of cases, folks are just buying what they like, which is great. But I think you can get a richer experience. My theory is you can get a richer experience by starting to understand a little bit more about the artists and, you know, why they make what they make and how they make it. So that's sort of the topic for today. With that, I'll let maybe each of you introduce yourself. Left to right on my screen sort of goes David, Alex, and Helena. So actually, you know what? We'll go ladies first. I'm going to go right.
Oh, yeah, right.
So,
okay.
Helena,
okay.
and then Alex, and then David, and maybe just an intro, and we'll be coming back around to talk about process, but maybe just some of your background would be great.
Okay, so I have like a mixed media career, so in a sense, like in the full sense of this word. So I worked for many years professionally as a software developer. I do consulting right now, but I also made art all my life. And for the last 2 years, I work specifically with AI, with GANs, and I find them fascinating. And I do a little bit of analog work still, but it becomes a training material for my GANs. So yeah.
And your start in AI was in your day job, right? It was like
yes, yeah,
something like that.
Yeah, I still do like some training and mostly like synthetic data, and that's how I came to know about GANs. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Alex.
I am Alex. I have a background in robotics engineering and math. The work I do usually has to do with humanity's relationship with technology. And most of my more recent work has been about human-machine collaboration. That sort of goes back to maybe 10 years ago. I made this little robot that would try to get people to talk to it and open up to it. And people were opening up to the robot more than they would to another person, it seemed. So I think that led my path of questioning what technology and humanity mean when you bring them together. My interest in machine learning and AI and sort of digital art, I guess AI sort of started with Deep Dream. I made a fairly well-seen video with Deep Dream, and yeah, I've been using different tools since then. I've been here at Stochastic Labs in Berkeley for the past, I guess, 6 years at this point. Yeah, doing art most of the time, and yeah, focusing on those topics.
Great, yeah, and you've got sort of a background having done some work with the more recent AI GAN stuff, but also a lot of what I would call like traditional programming, right? I think all three of you have done a fair amount of programming and worked with GANs. So at some point, I think we'll get into how are those different and how are they the same, but probably rely on you for some help on that too, Alex.
Great, yeah, sounds good.
Great, David?
Hello, I'm David Young. So my background originally was in undergrad, I studied computer science and actually worked for a couple years right out of school in the late 80s doing AI. So that was in the sort of the old-fashioned idea of what AI was before neural networks. A lot of like Lisp machine programming, a lot of unfortunately military-funded DARPA type of work. And I found it quite sort of dry and corporate. And so I went back to school. I went to the Media Lab at MIT, and studied visual studies, but I was incorporating AI into, how we could use computers to do automatic design, automatic layout, other kind of visual things. And I think, most of my career has in one way or the other been as a technology enthusiast, but also as trying to find new and innovative ways to use new technologies. So don't just kind of mimic what's come before with the new technology, but what does the new technology enable and allow us to do in different ways? And, so for whatever decades, I've been sort of doing that in different contexts, whether it's as a consultant, whether it's in-house in a large organization, whether it's an independent creative person. And I think as the sort of new AI emerged in the last couple of years with neural networks, I began to become I think I switched from being an enthusiast to being a bit of a naysayer. The joy that we had with the early internet, and I felt like we shouldn't just take AI as a given and let the giant corporations sort of tell us what we should do with it. And so I began experimenting with AI in a very actually non-technical way, because I wanted to see if there's a way that non-technical people could develop intuitions for what this technology is. And to say that it's not only up to Google and Facebook to say what the future of this is going to be, but it's for anybody. And along the way, I started finding that it's through aesthetic experiences that we can develop new intuitions for what AI is. And for me, as a creative person and as an artist, that sort of opened this whole new amazing sort of path that's allowed me to kind of be creative and explore what the technology is, but also actually get a bit deeper into it and sort of turn this into, I don't know, I find that getting away from the didactic explanation of what AI is and instead allowing people to experience it in different ways is a quite encouraging way to approach change in our society. It's a bit of a hand-wavy thing, but
No, I like that, and I think it's a good entry point into artists' relationships with tools and technology, and maybe trying to tease out the difference between a relationship with a tool and the larger questions around process. So there's another artist on Super Rare named, she goes by the Sarah Show. I think it's Sarah Zucker. I might get the last name wrong here. But she had said, there's some questions a month or so ago back about what process she used. And she said, it's not the wand, it's the witch, right? Basically saying it's not about the tools, it's about, me as the artist, right? But I think that tools certainly play a role in this too. So I'm curious, do you think, and we can go in whatever order folks want to go in, but do you think there's sort of a difference between, how you think of process and maybe craft/tools, right? I mean, is craft or your selection of tools a subset of your process? Or it sounds like, David, in your case, based on what you just said, the tool choice actually helps dictate some of your process beyond the fact of the tool, because you have this relationship to AI, right? That was, sort of negative, and you're trying to find a way to have a more positive approach to it, right? So anyone who wants to can sort of take that as a starter. Let me try to frame it more succinctly. What is process, and beyond your tool choice and your facility or craft with a given tool, what else is there that folks should know about process and how that unfolds? And if no one picks, I'm going to choose someone at random. I'll go with you, Alex. I'm going to put you on the spot.
So, in the work that I've done, I guess I've approached it both ways. I've approached it where the technology is similar to, the choice of paintbrush that I use at that particular moment. And a painter doesn't really expose that information. On the other hand, the generative art series I've done recently directly exposes the source code as part of the aesthetic object. So the tool that I built to render the artwork is in itself part of the output. So in that case, I'm making a very definite statement with the tool. In some of the more AI work that I've done, things like Deep Dream and the video I made with that, I didn't really go into too much depth of how the tool works, but everyone who sees asks questions like, why is the AI seeing animals and why is this crawling out of here? So it naturally leads to people sort of interrogating to get more information. Other works I've done with AI have involved the systems reading my brain waves and gaze. Let's see. So here's the EEG headset I wear. So in that case, the process is almost a performative part of the work, even though the audience doesn't see that aspect of it that is integral to how the work was made, and that story is definitely tied to it. But, I think a good piece of art needs to be interesting on some, surface level to begin with. It's got to bring the viewer into it, get them engaged to begin with. And if there are multiple levels after that that they want to engage in, that's great. And I think that makes the artwork, fleshed out a lot more. But yeah, I think it's different levels, and artwork can definitely include process, I think, as part of what the artwork is, or keep it hidden. And personally, I've definitely worked on it in both ways.
So I know, I think it's probably true for all three of you, and I think we might have dropped Helena. I'm sure she'll join back in when she can. But do you feel, pressure to use the latest tools when they come out, or to adopt the latest research? Or is it not so much that there is pressure, it's just a genuine fascination with new tech and an enthusiasm around what can be done with this new thing, or none of the above?
I'd say that there's definitely, when new tech comes out, there's the initial ooh shiny moment where people are sort of enamored with just novelty and what makes things new. You definitely can create interesting work with that, but more times often than not, that creates sort of surface level output, which could be fine for a while, but after people see a lot of that, that becomes, kind of done. And I think after that point is when people can really investigate the tool and use it in ways that are unique and really creative. So I'd say, there's a bit of pressure to try new things. I mean, for me personally, I'm just always interested in learning about new stuff and trying things out with that and poking and prodding it and seeing where it breaks. So I'd say there is a bit of pressure, but I also think as tools mature, then you see a lot of, more interesting work come from them.
I think I want to add on to what you just said, Alex, and I'm sorry that Helena isn't here because she also, I think, talks about the sort of nuclear arms race where we're always trying to get the biggest, best, tool to use. And it's a little ironic that this is a panel around using AI, which is a pretty new and gee-whizzy tool. But, I'm sort of arguing, I think, to Alex's point, is like we need to spend time with the tools that we work with to really understand them. And so there is a huge, I think, amount of pressure, whether it's sort of internal because it's the nature of our society that we always want something more and faster and flashier, and maybe as an artist it gives us license to step out of that and slow down. But I think in my work, the AI work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, I've been using GANs, and I haven't changed the code base that I've worked with at all. I've sort of been instead exploring it and trying to figure out, well, what happens when I use less and less data? Or, what are ways to reveal the sort of AI materiality that's unique to this tool? So rather than just being like, here's a new thing I can do with this new tool, instead, let's really work with this. And the more we work with it, the more we can actually draw something unique from it as a tool.
No, that's great. Yeah, I wish I just pinged Helena too to see if she'll be able to join us back, because I agreed that I think it's a great spot to bring her in that, and not to speak for her, but that she's written about how it can feel at times like whoever has access to or can spend, because there's money associated with especially with AI, with compute cycles and things like this, and connections to be able to get access to these tools. And it can feel like if you can use the tool first, then you can sort of get credit or plant the flag, right? And I think she's a strong advocate for focusing more. I mean, I don't want to marginalize the use of the tech, but focusing more on what I see as sort of the art side of it, right? And being artful and trying to get more from the tools that you have at your disposal, and worrying less about, you know, necessarily having the latest and greatest thing. But yeah.
And I think that I was going to say, I mean, I think that even feeds into the work that we do, that a lot of times the tools have limitations. And, you know, if we get the next version of the tool, or we buy a higher end computer, we can sort of move the next level of what those limitations are. You know, and sometimes I get very frustrated that the images that I produce aren't as high resolution as I might ideally want them to be. But, you know, that's the nature of what the tool is. And so rather than sort of fighting it and say, well, I would need to have 8 hands and 8 paintbrushes or whatever all simultaneously, just embrace the low resolution nature of it, and, you know, work within that constraint.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think one of the objectives, if we can get there, and it's hard on a panel, I know, David, you and I have tried to do it in the past. Oh, here we go. Here's Helena. Before I move on, I want to extend a chance to Helena Helena, you're back. Or at least your artwork is back. Helena.
Pretty soon they'll replace all of us on a panel with just, you know, GPT-3 and some avatars talking. Well, we can we can just send our artwork forward for us.
Yeah, we may not be that far off of that time period. Helena, are you with us? Well, we have our nice artwork.
Mm-hmm. We could talk about it behind her back.
Yeah, let's have a critique of Helena's artwork. So while we're waiting for Helena to come back, and I do want to come back to her and ask, again, a little bit more about the relationships to tools and the arms race. Oh, and we lost her. Maybe we can talk a little bit higher level. And I understand it can be monotonous sometimes to try to explain what GANs are or what programming or coding is. But I think part of the objective of for this audience and for this panel is to try to help folks wrap their head around a little bit about what it is you guys even do. I know it can be boring as an artist to try to get down to like the nuts and bolts of what you're doing, but I think there's a lot of misleading media out there about what AI art is in particular, and there's actually a lack of any description of what generative art is in the mainstream beyond AI art. And I think because of the misleading information out there, people wonder what role the human plays, if any at all, right? Which isn't their fault. I don't blame an audience for not getting that, you know, the human artist is really important, because the media is so misleading out there. So maybe just a high level, you know, I might try to assign these a little bit. I might ask you, David, just high level to explain what AI and GANs are. And then I might ask you, Alex, and I know these are sort of Herculean tasks to ask to simplify, but just a little bit what programming, you know, programmatic art is like, and, you know, at the highest possible level, right? So just so that folks can kind of get a sense of what is this, right? It's not, you're not going into a program like Photoshop and hitting a drop-down menu and like applying filters and things like that. There's, you know, it's some fairly technical and nuanced things that would vary from artist to artist. And you've got, you know, a pretty significant role in what you're producing. So maybe just high-level description, and I could start with you, David, on, you know, what are GANs, and, you know, how do you make art using AI? What does that look like at a high level?
Totally, and I'll say something in the beginning, which is actually the lead for Alex, which is, you know, before neural networks and machine learning, which is sort of the branch of AI art, or art with AI that we're talking about. Generative art was more writing instructions. So the artist would write down the rules of what they want the machine to do, and then the machine would go and execute those rules. With machine learning, it's almost the exact opposite. We're showing material to the machine. We're training it on material. It builds some sort of understanding in its neural network, which is an object or a concept which we cannot open up to understand what it actually knows. and it then generates some material. And, you know, I think while there is a huge amount of technical stuff that's going on within these networks, I don't really understand fully what's happening in there. And I think that's an important part of how I'm approaching my work, is that I don't think you have to be an expert in order to use this technology, any more than you have to be an expert in how you make a paintbrush or how you build a pencil. And so my understanding of how a GAN works, and I'm saying this in an incredibly simplified way because I think that's really all you need to understand as an outsider, is that there's sort of two components. There's what's called the discriminator. And so you show the discriminator lots and lots of images. And over time, it builds a sort of understanding of what you've been showing it. In parallel to that, there is a generator. And the generator starts knowing nothing. Sort of what in some of my work, I'm referring to as a tabula rasa, just an empty mind. And it generates an image. The first image it generates is just static. It shows it to the discriminator, which says either yes or no, this is close to what I've been seeing from my training data. And gradually, that generator builds a better understanding of that subject matter. And the images that it generates get closer and closer to what the discriminator was trained on. If you show it hundreds of millions of images, the results are going to be surprisingly accurate and very close to what was trained on. If, like in my work, I show it a handful of images, maybe 10, maybe 100, and it generates stuff that's sort of weird, but that weirdness helps reflect this notion that the mind of a machine or a machine learning network is quite arbitrary based on what we're showing it. And so a lot of the work of the artist, I think, is in curating what material we train the machine on.
Got it. So I think to help folks understand where the human intervention comes in, maybe if we do sort of a contrast of your approach to, say, Mario's or Helena's, right? You know, I'd like folks to understand why, even though the tools may overlap a little bit, the work looks significantly different, particularly for what I would describe as the more innovative or thoughtful artists in the space. And, you know, I mean, my words, but, you know, what makes the way that you would approach this different than, say, Helena, where she's not here, or Mario? And I'm happy to give, you know, my thoughts too, if it's easier, and then maybe you can expand upon that. But
well, yeah, pretend you're Mario or Helena. What would you say?
So, I mean, I don't know that I can speak for them, but what I would say that what stands out for me about your work relative to the other generative artists or the other AI artists that I've seen is that you've made an intentional artistic decision to restrict the number of training materials that you put into the work, right? And I think that that's a decision because the aspects of this that you find particularly interesting are, if we can reduce what we put in, does it make it easier for us to understand, you know, what's actually going on? It's hard sometimes when there's a whole bunch going on. Whereas I think some of the other artists want more. I interviewed Jared Tarbell a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about how he sees Mario Klinchman's process. And he was saying, you know, GAN art or AI art is kind of like a soup. You can add a bunch of different spices to it and ingredients, but you don't have full control over it. And you can wreck the soup if you're not careful. And there's artistry in choosing the ingredients. You know, so some artists, like maybe Mario, puts in a heck of a lot more images and is pulling from multiple sources, which is sort of the opposite of what you're doing, right? Because he actually doesn't want it to be narrowed down to a single or a smaller number of sources. He almost wants to cover the number of sources by blending different, you know, areas together. But I mean, I don't want to necessarily interview myself, but I think, but I think there's opportunity here to clarify that person to person, it's really the decisions that the human's making that I think are more important than what the tool produces, right? Actually, I'm going to throw this to Alex before I bug him because he, works with, do you want to say something, David?
I appreciate you speaking for me about what I just do. So that's actually great to hear. I'll add that, the reason that I use small data and constrain it isn't sort of just an arbitrary artistic choice. Although I also find the constraint quite liberating, but I do it in contrast to kind of big technology. So we think of what's called the Frightful Five: Google, Facebook, Amazon, et cetera, and that they have these huge and massive amounts of data, and that they seem to be the ones that are controlling us. And I want to approach this from a totally different perspective. And so the notion of smallness or little AI is a really important kind of core in my approach.
Yep, no, that makes sense. It's not just a tool decision. It's a philosophical decision, right? You're exploring something that goes beyond the tool. So I think in throwing it to Alex, Alex, you do a bunch of work with AI too. So before I kind of ask you to help understand sort of what more traditional programmatic, generative art looks like, how would you say you're using AI, and maybe in particular GANs, which is the thing that people are going to be most familiar with, I think, over the last year or two? How do you feel like you're using them in a way that differentiates what you're creating from other people? Why is it about you as a person and not just another person using a similar tool? Maybe help folks understand that.
Yeah, for me, for GAN specifically, I tried to bring in that human machine, collaboration idea, as much as collaboration, can be with a machine. So for the, I mentioned, my brain waves and body signals choosing outputs. And the way those outputs were chosen, at least for earlier work, was with another model that I trained on wearing the EEG headset, reading the brain waves, while I was looking at images that I like of art and images that I don't like of art. And a model was made to try to differentiate when the machine sees this brain signal, am I looking at something I like or I don't like? Just a very simple way. So I built basically on top of a generative system, a system which is very unique to my tastes as an artist. I don't make any claims about the accuracy of it being able to choose what I like and I don't like from the brainwaves, but it is that sort of step that brings me closer into the machine. And before I used GANs, I actually trained that model to choose parameters for fractals, which are not AI. So the AI was actually hidden. The AI was in the system that was reading my reactions to things and then choosing very generative mathematical outputs. I think there's a framed one behind me there. So it started as that, and then I ported it over to GANs. And obviously there's a lot more stuff out there besides GANs, which are doing interesting things as well. There's all sorts of text generation and other ways things are manipulated and looked at by machine learning. So for me, yeah, it's taking that extra step of bringing the the human in, besides just sort of manually curating images, and yeah, looking at things which are connecting technology directly into my body. I was also, you can't see it here, but on my monitor I have a gaze tracker. So I had been working with the system actually seeing where I look on the screen and where my eyes are drifting and things I pause on when I look at it. So the system's trying to intuit my observation of the artwork and make things from that. Yeah, I'll talk about it next probably, but yeah, the more sort of traditional generative stuff, I've also been trying to show my creation process of the code as part of the artwork itself.
Great. Yeah, it looks like we might have Helena. Let me try to admit her again. I think they were losing power, so I feel bad. Probably these storms. It sounds like we're all expecting a storm of one type or another tonight.
Okay, sorry about this.
No, that's okay. We're so excited to have you back. I'll try to do my best impersonation. Actually, we did do.
Yeah, that's good.
We did do a fair amount of talking about how important you're writing about the arms race in technology is.
Okay.
So maybe we'll go back to that for a bit, and I'll come back to you, Alex, to talk a bit more about the programmatic generative art. So I think before we lost you, Helena, we were trying to talk about how important or not important the tool is in terms of dictating what people are producing. And I actually just squarely put the question to Alex, you know, do you feel pressure when new tech comes out to try to like squeeze the juice first on the new technology before other folks get to it? Or, you know, is it just merely that we're all kind of nerds and we get excited when new tech comes out and we want to try to use it? And I think we were all sort of interested in your take, which I sort of described as like, maybe it's less about chasing the new tool and trying to figure out how to build the relationship with the existing tool and get to know it to produce more artistic, you know, output or something like that. But since we have you, I'll let you kind of share your thoughts on that.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I'm not into, I mean, though I'm technologist, I'm not that much into technology for technology's sake, and I stay away actually with all this like new developments in GANs. First of all, because, I mean, mostly because they are unwieldy, even if I have quite powerful GPU right now, thanks to NVIDIA guys. But still, I mean, it's just like, I still pretty much use old models because I think like for me, they give better results because they're kind of like confused models. They don't try to reproduce the reality. And I mean, with GANs especially, I start more from the material perspective. So I see something that might be an interesting training set and go from there. And it's always like, what if? I mean, I never have some kind of idea what it will bring me. A lot, I mean, I just trained for the last 2 days, something that I thought like a very good idea. It didn't produce anything. I mean, some intermediate results, but like what happened with our recent project with Dmitry Chernyak, when I took his generative art, and for a long time I was thinking, what happens if I take a generative like data set and try to train again on it? And I think like we got some pretty interesting results.
I love that. Yeah, I love that series.
Unexpected to both of us. So that's actually my process in a nutshell, starting from some interesting material and see where it takes me.
That's great.
Can I
go ahead, David?
I was going to add to that. I think, you know, this idea of training the GAN on generative art is so cool because, you know, I've been doing some work that's similar to that, where I've been adjusting the feed, you know, so rather than it learning from photos in a big folder, I've written code which generates art. So I've written the rules for generative art, and then I have those images fed into the GAN. And so it's almost like there's this infinite amount of material that you can train the GAN with to see how close it comes to sort of understanding what those rules were, which I think is exactly the same thing as what you're talking about.
Yeah, you know, with a small exception, because there is a work done like by researchers from Facebook, where they took like this approach like in parallel, because probably it's an obvious idea, just trying to mimic what happens. And because, I mean, for them, the result was more interesting to reproduce exactly the synthetic, the generative data, then I think they got less interesting results. Because they got pretty close to the input. I mean, not quite. And that was not the idea. The idea was to stay somewhere like on this like human path, like with more human touch, or sort of like ambiguity and sort of artisanship.
Absolutely. I think, you know, you were offline when we were talking about the notion that we don't want to just train these systems on huge quantities of data where the results are so close to the original data that it's not very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so part of the artistry, I think, is the intervention, right? As the tech gets better and better, it's not necessarily the case that the art will get better and better, because
absolutely,
we're not trying to get to super. I have video games on the brain because I've been watching the documentary on Netflix, and I noticed that for me, the Nintendo games are always more fun, even though they're often lower res or lower pixel than these super realistic 3D games, right? And I think there's maybe an analogy there. Realism, or replicating realism isn't necessarily the goal of the artist. I want to throw a pin in one thing that you mentioned, Helena, and come back to it in a bit about how you don't necessarily know what's going to come out. You put something in and you think, that this will work really well for the training. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. So I'll come back with a question on sort of linear versus what I would call like circuitous process. But I want to give Alex a chance to maybe help folks understand a little bit higher level what the non-AI generative art process is like, just sort of at a high level, so folks can kind of follow along with the conversation.
Yeah, so I mean, the base thing to start with is, what exactly is coding and what is computer code? I mean, in a very simple way, it's an abstraction of mathematical operations. So it's a way to explain to a machine what you want it to do logically. And because of the discrete units that make up the structure of code, you can assemble things in infinite ways and infinite complexity and get sort of crazy outputs. At the end of the day, even AI and GANs are coming down to ones and zeros, ons and offs, simple mathematical operations, but these mathematical operations are being stacked upon each other, billions and billions thick, which is why when output may be unpredictable or hard to figure out, at the end of the day, it has to be still logical because it was done by a machine. So there's still this cold logic. It's not, the computer's not making any decisions. It will, if a computer had wheels and you told it to drive off the end of a bridge, it would do that. It's not, it just follows what you tell it. But the really cool thing is that complexity. Yeah, I mean, you can make a parallel in, things like physics. Physics are made out, things that are around us are made out of these simple base rules. But, you assemble an atom out of quarks and plasma, you get the plasmas and, atoms and structures, then you can see how, complexity arises out of simplicity. Classical generative art is about telling the machine the type output you want, and you can add randomness to that, and you can also get unexpected outputs. Again, the more complex you make something, the more opportunity for unexpected information coming out of it is. You could do something as simple as telling a screen to draw a square and filling it with a color. That's a very simple output. Or you could tell a screen to draw a million squares and have their diameter be random. And if you do something like that, you're going to get unexpected outputs. While mathematically, it's sort of understood. To us, it's something that's surprising. At the end of the day, all computer language is written for humans because what the machine understands is just very low level. But the amount of creativity you can create with that arises out of the inherent mathematics and complexity.
No, that's great. And I think it actually ties back into this topic that I kind of put a pin in around linearity and nonlinearity of process, right? So I think if you've never coded before, I have this story that I probably tell too often about a professor who will eventually figure out that I'm talking about him in grad school, who was teaching in this program that was largely about coding and art and things like that. But he said, well, the problem with coding and programming and generative art is that there are no mistakes. And I think if you've never programmed before, you assume that because a program operates the same way every single time, that maybe somehow this generative art thing is nerds thinking about exactly what it is they want to make, coding in that exact thing that they have in their head and it executing the same way every time. And as someone who's done some painting, a lot of painting in undergrad and then some coding in grad school, I think coding's a lot more like painting in that there's a bunch of surprises and it's fairly circuitous and not this linear, I'm going to make A, I have it in my head and I program it out. But I'd like to see how you guys think about that, and whether it's AI art or whether it's programming. Is it sort of this architect's view where you like have a blueprint of what you want to produce and you're marching towards that vision? Or are you making, just making a lot of work and playing and moving knobs and dials and changing things and seeing what comes out the other side and making adjustments based on what's surprised you that's come out. I mean, to me, that's sort of the way that I've worked in the past, and it's sort of surprising, but I love hearing people talk about how they see that work. Maybe I'll move it to David and then give you both, everyone else a chance to talk about that too. How much of that process, David, is sort of linear and how much is sort of circuitous, and what's the interplay look like?
Totally. So I would say I was going to say it's changed a lot over the years, but now I'm going to have second thoughts. So, in the olden days when I was doing coding and creative stuff, I really embraced this idea of sketching in code. So, rather than approach the computer with to your point, of an idea of what you want the output to be, instead, start coding some stuff, see what comes out of it, begin to adjust that code, and it becomes a dialogue between the act of coding and the output and the results that you get. And I found, that being fluent at programming gave me a new tool in which to kind of explore ideas, and that was quite important. I think with the ideas now around machine learning, it's a lot harder to actually play with the code itself, because the code is quite, the code for a GAN is like 2 pages long. It's not very much at all. So, what you can do with that code, I mean, as I've worked with this, I've begun to kind of tweak little things, but it's still incredibly cryptic to me. And instead, it's back to your point where I am experimenting with what I feed it, what I train it with, seeing how those changes impact the output of the system. And so it's almost like the exact opposite, where I am, poking at this black box in different ways, trying to deduce what's inside of it and develop some sort of intuition. And although that may not be the most scientific approach to this, I think it does reflect the need for us to develop non-technical intuitions for what AI is. But it also helps me realize that these systems really they learn only what we feed them. And so in the creative and the artistic space, I've learned like curation of the images that I train the machine on is incredibly important to get results that seem kind of appealing to me. But it's also illuminated to me the hazards of AI in kind of social sector work, where if we train machines on biased data, of course we're going to end up with racist algorithms. And so, this is both kind of learning about AI in the artistic space, as well as helping me become more aware of the problems of AI in the kind of the social space.
It's helpful. I think curation, it seems like curation has sort of replaced some of the play that happened in traditional generative art with coding and tweaking. I think because there's such a large output, right?
Yeah, and I'll add one other thing, which is like the thing that I find quite, I mean, I really am enjoying working with AI, but the thing that's so frustrating with it is how slow it is. And so, you run a new batch to try to train something, and it could take days before you see the output from it. And so developing sort of intuitions around these things over these long time frames it's really different than trying to pick up how to play the piano, where you get this almost instantaneous feedback.
Makes sense. Yeah, Helena, how do you feel? So I know, Helena, you and I talked a little bit about the curation side of this. And where do you feel like maybe the play is and maybe where the work is? I'm the king of bad analogies, but I feel like there's like building the surfboard, right? Which is an important craft, and understanding your tools. And if you can't build the surfboard, you're not going to be able to surf. And then once you've done that work, there's sort of the surfing part. And I think all art modes, whether it's printmaking or painting or GANs, or whatever, there's a part where you better know your tools and your craft, and there's, and then there's sort of the play, right? How do you think about this linearity, non-linearity, and curation? And maybe I haven't captured your process at all. What do you think?
Because there is nothing to capture. I mean, there is no process. Sometimes I look at pieces that I did like a month ago. I can't tell you how I did it because I move. I hate like the repetition, the boredomness of it. And basically that's why I call myself perpetual amateur, because I'm trying to move like ahead with the stuff. And it's another kind of like, and as usually I tweeted about it, and I think like being online all the time is basically force you to produce, and not because you kind of like entertainer, but also for yourself. It's just like, I think it's the law of the land. I mean, it's just with conceptual art, you can't repeat it. I mean, you can't repeat yourself because your tools are so mechanical in a sense. It's becomes boring for like everybody involved, for viewers, for yourself. So that's why, but there is a lot of kind of interesting segues and sideways. And that's why I took like printmaking. I collaborated with ceramicists, because I think like around this, there are like so many interesting things you can do. So yeah, that's my process, no process.
So it sounds like your process is the break process, right? So
yeah,
introduce new tools, introduce new people, introduce, find ways to get yourself making new materials by changing what you're putting in. And
yeah, but also kind of like take it back to the, and that's why it's like bookending. You start with like physical artifacts, with paintings, with my like paintings, and then bring it back to the painting. And that's why I'm so into printmaking.
Got it. And do you think, as someone who does a fair amount of like drawing and painting and things like that, do you feel like that process is entirely different or unique from your generative process, or do you think there's overlap?
I think it's like, it's different. It's like, it's more tactile because you work with hands. Like in every case you work with your eyes, with your brain, but here it's like a lot of like manual job and like a lot of craft, which we miss. Like David said, like you train the model for many days, it's just like no craft here. Yeah, so I would say, and one more thing, like again, bringing it like with what we started around, like tools that are being built by Google. So you can kind of like compete with this stuff. And that's why I kind of like keeping it like small, outsider kind of things. It's like the only way to survive.
Got it. Yeah, I think one of the words that you locked onto, or that you said there that I locked onto, was sort of conceptual. And I think I'm going to kick it over to maybe to Alex now. I think when I think of your work, Alex, I think all three of you have conceptual and social components to what you're doing. But I think particularly, Alex, when I think of your work, I think of it as largely conceptual. And I wonder, because at least A, am I right or wrong about it being conceptual? And then B, I wonder where it's so heavily conceptual, if that steers you more towards having preconceived ideas when you start your projects, or is it still more that the projects unfold as you're working on them?
Yeah, I mean, a certain amount of discovery and experimentation and surprise, I think, is important. Especially in a lot of the work that I do. Yeah, I do approach most everything from this conceptual point of view. I don't usually paint something that is, say, a still life or something. To me, like the process of how I made the artwork is very important. Say in a generative work, if I were to choose a number, I wouldn't choose a number at random. I'd pick a Fibonacci sequence number or something. So every decision for me is sort of part of that output. And there's definitely, I don't know, to me, the questions are also interesting, and around a lot of the stuff I've done, there's been questions of where does the artist lie, and maybe even who's the artist, and where do I come in? And those are actually questions I find quite interesting, and I like to come through in the work. For instance, what would be a good example? Like the TED talk that you wrote about, where I I fed in all the TED transcripts into a text generation model to make a model, and then it spit out a bunch, and then I turned that into a PowerPoint, and I did that talk on TEDx stage, where the AI was almost puppeteering me in a way. And that in itself has, you know, like I said earlier, I think a lot of good works have something that brings you in to begin with, has something that's interesting. And then if you want to dig deeper about what it really means, then you go from there. You know, in that case, there was, you know, because it was kind of humorous and funny, it was accessible to people, and it brought them in. And, you know, on the other side of things, I hand curated 50,000 album cover images, put them together into a data set, and that data set was trained, and now anyone can play with that on a website called Artbreeder, which Joel Simon made, who's actually in the studio next to me here. Yeah, that to me is also kind of a conceptual artwork, in so much that, you know, I spent a lot of time to make sure that the output was as good as possible because of the curation of the data set. I spent a lot of manual time on it. And now anyone can go and make outputs by tweaking knobs. So again, there's a question of where is the authorship in there? Who, you know, is it, you know, was it more of an artistic thing to do to curate it, or more of an artistic thing to do to fiddle the knobs? And I think these are still open questions. You know, and conceptual art for me leaves the door open for people to, you know, bring their own interpretation, ask their own questions, sort of dig a bit deeper. And like I said, a lot of my work is about human-machine collaboration, the future of humanity and technology, and getting people to think about some of those ideas, I think is important. Yeah, but leaving room for surprise, even in conceptual art, I think is important.
Got it. So yeah, even though it's conceptual, it's not that you start with a concept and then you just kind of slog away at it. You know, there's still surprise, and it's evolving as you work on it, and you're actually sort of I don't know that I put these words in your mouth, but kind of co-authoring it with your viewer or your end user. You expect and want feedback and them to play a role in completing the work. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, there is sort of a, you know, realizing the idea, in so much that, you know, for the EEG headset, I had to practically create a system which would, you know, display these images and make a model that would try to determine what I like and I don't like. But the actual output from that was kind of unexpected. Yeah, while, you know, you may sort of plant a flag in the ground about what you want to build, you definitely can be flexible from there. And I've done, you know, my background is sort of in robotics and hardware more than software. And in those cases, it's a bit more hard to experiment, because to change something physical, you got to buy something new or chop something apart, or, you know, it's a lot harder just to play around with things, unless you have like a Lego set or something. So I'd say software is where you get that flexibility. You know, even the name is software versus hard. You know, it's a soft, malleable thing. So I think, you know, if you playing around with the ability for these things to be soft, I think is fun and important.
Great. No, that's a great answer. I think that's really helpful. One of the things that I'm thinking about while, you know, you're responding to that is this desire from the artist side, on whether or not, it's kind of an age-old question that goes back to before I would, you know, tech art or generative art, of should an artwork be able to stand on its own, or should it not be able to stand on its own? And I don't think personally there's a wrong or right answer, but I know that for every artist you speak to, there's usually wildly different answers, you know, in terms of, some artists are like, no, I want you to know about me and my background and my thought process to this work. And some are like, no, it's really important to me that you just like this work, and I don't necessarily need to be, present, you know, or bias, right? So, and an extension of that in this more modern generative art world is maybe the question about whether the output is the artwork or the actual model or the machine, right? So maybe I'll go to David with that one. But I want to also get other folks' thoughts on that. I think Helena might have, I don't want to misquote you, but you might have actually said something to the effect of you want people to appreciate the actual work, right? But we'll start with David, then I'll go to Helena and come back around to Alex, because I think this will be an interesting one.
I mean, I think, well, we'll see. I was going to say I may pre-echo Helena, in which I really do think that it's the aesthetics that should be the first thing that draws somebody in. So they should look at the work and find it. I mean, I'm told I'm not allowed to say beautiful. That's up to the viewer to say, but I would like to, but I would like to say, you know, I want people to think my work is beautiful. And at the same time, I think there is a huge amount of concept behind it that's also important, that by understanding that concept, it gives a deeper appreciation. So that's why I write. That's why I come on panels and talk about it, because I want people to, you know, and I hopefully I write in a way which is for the public or for collectors, not just for technical people or for other artists. And so I think, you know, I answered the question. It's like, I think beauty should be the doorway in, but understanding sort of what's behind the scenes only makes that more beautiful.
It's great. It's how I read art as an art lover, right? So I can't think my way into loving a piece. I have to have a visceral emotional reaction to something before I'll go through the effort of trying to understand additional detail, whether it's reading the you know, panel on the side, or, you know, talking to the artist or whatever, you know, so
Yeah, and I was going to say, I mean, I've been reading a lot of the criticism written by Peter Stendhal, the art critic for the New Yorker, and his approach is exactly that. You know, it's like he goes into a kind of dialogue with the work to understand it and what is his reaction to it. And, you know, it's that kind of conversation that builds some sort of appreciation for the work.
Can it be frustrating? So like, I'll think like last summer, you produced that awesome new set of work that I got really excited about, but I think I read it very differently from your intention, right? So I was like, these are amazing. These AI, you know, the artworks that you're producing look so much like the abstract expressionists who are trying to tap into this sort of subconscious symbolism, right, from Jung and things like that. And I kind of came back to you with like all this enthusiasm, and I wonder, was that like, you know, oh, that's a lot of effort in a direction that I don't intend you to read, Jason? Or is it, oh, that's cool that these can produce enough, you know, variation that, you know, there's multiple interpretations. As an artist, is that satisfying or initially kind of frustrating, or how do you read that?
I mean, you know, anything that is a trigger that hooks you in to want to understand more is a good thing. You know, if you say something, well, that looks like something my dog could have painted, that maybe is a little less
Depends
positive.
on how talented the dog is.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Yeah. You were very generous to let me kind of go up aggressively about that set of work, because I was just really excited about it.
Yeah. But I mean, you know, I think, you know, it does have this kind of quality of the sublime, because the work it does have echoes of some abstract expressionists, and, you know, that was not where I was trying to go with it. But it's interesting that, you know, when you train a machine on 3 solid colors or something, you end up with this sort of trained mind, which is, you know, I can't explain what it is, but it's so different. And so it forces you, or it enables you to look at the work in a really different way than if you're looking at a work that is trying to reproduce an image of a tree or a still life or something.
Yep. Yep. I really like that that series. So Helena, I want to give you a chance, because I think I maybe misquoted you, but there was a tweet maybe the other day that you kind of wanted people to like the work, and it shouldn't matter so much whether or not you like the artist, or what, you know, help me understand what that was and how it fits in this maybe.
Yeah, I actually don't remember, but basically I think there are like 2 levels, and David talked about it. I mean, there is this visceral level, and that's why, I mean, when I started doing GANs, the sort of encouragement I got from people who had nothing to do with software, and that's why it gave me kind of like energy to continue. On the other hand, it's like with wine appreciation or food appreciation, the more you know about the process, and that's why, like, when I got into like food, I started cooking, because for me it's always like, first of all, you need to be self-sufficient, and then kind of like you learn by doing. And like for many of us, like seeing something, and like when I look at David's works, I always, oh, how did he do it? I mean, like this always kind of like triggers your curiosity. So that's another level. And I think it's like, I mean, a good wine is a good analogy in this case. I mean, you need to build appreciation, but then again, with something like Veuve Clicquot, you can have zero kind of understanding in wine, and you get it right away, because it's like the taste talks by itself.
Yeah, so someone could, you know, you could go into an art museum or onto Super and have your own, no one can negate that you've had an emotional response or reaction to something, right? No matter what that work is or who that person is. But I think to be able to go deeper, there has to be something there, from the artist side, right? To have more investigation.
But in a sense, it's like another cultural problem, because we tend to be afraid of stuff or saying the wrong things. So that's why maybe like kids have better appreciation because they have no barriers. Like your niece with, yeah.
Fewer
So,
right?
yeah. That's why, again, I mean, sometimes we just don't let us, our kind of like inner understanding to do its job.
Yep. No, I think that's helpful. Well, I want to be conscientious of everyone's time. Time for two more questions. I know we're a little bit past 7. Do you guys have time for maybe 1 or 2 more?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think one of the things that might be sort of telling is, and I think you hit on it a little bit, Helena, in your answer, but what is it that if we're talking to folks that maybe don't know AI or generative art that well, and we're trying to say, well, here's some ways to look at it, or ways to go a few levels deeper than just your initial reaction to it. What are some ways things about other people's work that get you excited, or ways that you look at other people's work? Maybe I'll just keep going through sort of the loop here. I'm going to throw Alex in the pool first here on this one. So, what is it when you look at somebody else's work that you're like, oh, that's really cool, or I like that because, or I'd like to see more of their work because, or this artist is really exploring X, or and this presupposes that you all even like other work in this genre. If you don't, you can tell me I don't like anyone's work, but you don't have to list who you like and don't like. But I'm just curious how you look at other people's work, and is it differently than how you look at your own work?
Yeah, it's funny. I think I definitely like work that I wouldn't make myself. That's for sure. I think that's probably all of us would agree on that sort of thing. Or work we wouldn't even be able to produce ourselves just from, a technical or, could love a painting and not be able to paint sort of thing. Yeah, I think people, I mean, this might come back to this question of beauty. I mean, I think of, when I go to a museum, I usually, it's funny, I usually go through everything quickly at first. Something might catch my eye and I'll pause, but I'll just keep going. And then I'll come back to it. And then I'll sort of go to the ones that I sort of had an initial reaction to and try to dig deeper into them. And to me, that's sort of the way I view stuff. Sometimes it's not about beauty. I mean, I forget the name of the artist, but one thing that comes to mind, there was this artist who had these 2 ugly industrial fans, like these big cage things you'd see like in a subway station. But the beauty of it was that one was plugged in and on, and the other was unplugged, but next to it. And the one that was on was making the unplugged one spin. So the beauty of it to me was the idea of one fan that was on moving one that was unpowered, and that was sort of a metaphorical understanding. That was a conceptual beauty to me, and not much of a visual beauty. So I think when people are approaching these technical art projects or artworks, that there's both there. There's this beauty that can happen. There's this visual beauty. I've seen a lot of really beautiful generative works. And I've also seen works which are, maybe not as visually interesting, but the reason behind it or the conceptual idea or the process to me really drew me in. And I feel like those are the ones that get me thinking about them longer. If I see something beautiful, like I'll have an initial visceral reaction. And if there's nothing much more to it, it sort of fades. But if something's both intriguing for some reason and also has a deeper meaning or something I can dig in further, those are the works I think I remember a lot longer and have a more meaningful impact to me. And I think those are also works which I can view from a personal point of view. Like you said, the way you viewed David's work, to me, that I think is great. And having some room for that interpretation, I think just adds a lot to things.
No, I love the idea of conceptual beauty. I was in a conversation with an artist the other day, and I actually said out loud, and it sounded dumb, but I'm sticking with it, that that the ugly can be beautiful. So Hyman Bloom is a painter that I hadn't heard of that was painting cadavers locally and had a show in the MFA. And they're just tremendously beautiful paintings on a painting level, but they're cadavers, right? Or Otto Dix's war paintings, right? So I think beauty can seem like a thin word when it can only describe flowers or whatever, you know, but when beauty can be used to describe a full range of emotions, and maybe I'm abusing the word there, but I like your use of conceptual beauty. I think that's certainly as good a descriptor as I can think of for what it is that initially captures my interest. I like that. David, what do you think?
This is a hard question. I was going to say, I tend not to be that pulled into things that are maybe clever or humorous. I also am really, I look at work and I see other artists working with AI, and there's the ones that surprise me are the ones that sort of excite me the most. But I think there was a book that was written years ago. I think it was written for the Getty Museum when they were building their new museum in Los Angeles, trying to figure out like how do you facilitate better interaction between people and art. And there was some articles in there, essays in there, which was talking about like, well, what is the aesthetic experience, and how do you describe it, and how do you kind of find ways to sort of encourage it? And I don't think there was an answer. It was more like the aesthetic experience is something that goes beyond words. And so, trying to use words to describe it is sort of like, it's a pointless activity. So, I'm sort of shirking answering your question because there are things that I see that deeply connect with me in some way. And I don't think I can say, here's the rule for what those things are. It's more like, probably if you've trained an AI based on what I like in the world, it would be able to tell you this is things that David's going to like, and these are the things that it's not going to like, which is pretty boring application of AI. But I would like to think that I'm quite arbitrary and unknowable in what it is that I like. And it's always even a surprise to me when I find something new that excites me.
Yeah, so there's some mystery and it's not so systematic. You can't say if I put ingredients A, B, and C together, it'll produce an artwork that David likes, right? I get that. And then there's, I like that you said that you can't put it into words, since that's mostly what I do. But I agree with you in that I think there is something that you're doing whenever you talk about. I would say in lieu of being able to see and experience the actual artwork, whenever you're describing it in any other modality, you're probably watering it down, right? There's a reason the artist chose to make it visual or conceptual or whatever it was that they did in the first place. So as a replacement, I think, words fail and are watered down, but as an augmentation maybe of the work, I think, words or conversation can help, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. And, we when we see something that appeals to us for whatever reason, we also want to share that with other people. And so we do then sort of revert to words to be able to have that kind of social experience around this object that exists in a wordless space. Yep.
No, I think that's fair. And you're an excellent writer. I think you're one of the better writers out there in terms of describing your process and stuff. Actually, you and Helena both, and I've been happy to publish your works in the past and hope to again in the future.
Thank you.
So Helena, what do you like in other people's work, and how do you evaluate other people's work, or what do you look for, or what excites you? How are you looking at other works?
Two things. Like, I like clever stuff, and I like beautiful stuff. And basically that's for me, especially in this ugly world we have right now. I think we are totally lacking, not lacking, but not kind of like suckering something, but still sort of beautiful, kind, and funny. Because I think we stopped laughing. We kind of like laughing, but it's like sarcasm. And it's like back in Russia. I mean, one of the things that I hated there is like totally like you live in perpetual sarcasm, And I liked when I moved to US, I liked like optimism of people, like kindness. And now we're kind of like back to this like ugly reality of kind of complete irony and sarcasm and stuff. So I'm trying to sort of like, maybe it's escapism, but still, I mean, I want to do like funny things, kind things, and beautiful things.
Would it be, is it too much of a sugary word to say cheerful? Like, you know, I mean, are you looking for something not so negative?
Yeah, in a sense, that's, and actually, like, I remember one guy put me in the list, people who bring joy in on Twitter. So I think it's like the best compliment.
Yep, I could see that. That's sort of the art as antidote approach, right? So we have sort of an increasingly intense world, at least from my perspective. I feel like the world's getting increasingly serious, increasingly polarized, increasingly intense. And while art can address issues and help untangle them, I'm a believer and a user and an addict to art as a way to get away from some of those things too, right? So
Yeah,
that's
yeah, and there are different artists. I mean, like Toni Morrison said, all art is political, but yeah, you can kind of like maybe just give people some hope and cure and moment of relief.
Yep, I love that. So maybe in finishing the last question, just something that you're working on that you're excited about, or just something that you're excited about in general, and then we'll kind of wrap it up from there. Well, I mean, I'd feel like bad if I'm like, what are you working on that you're excited about? So I know as a sometimes working artist, there are often dry spells when I'm not working on anything. So I wouldn't want to be asked that question if I was like, I haven't made crap in 5 months because I'm in a dry spell. Thanks, Jason, you know? So I'm giving the out of, you know, what are you excited about right now, or what are you working on that you're kind of excited about? And let's do it in reverse. We'll start with Helena this time, and then we'll work our way back around the opposite direction.
Yeah, I like just finished one book, like basically what I call GAN Commedia Erudita. So I finished chapter 1, and I'm working on the book of vegan. So yeah, I have like I found with like GAN multiples, it's a good thing to do like books. So yeah, I mean this keeps me busy, and this keeps me very excited.
As someone who owns some of your books, it's a great way to consume and appreciate your work too. So
yeah, because
too.
Thank you.
David, since we're wrapping around.
So I'm still playing with GANs. That's not going away anytime soon. I've also been working as part of a group called Dark Taxa, which is a sort of international group of what they would probably call, well, they wouldn't call themselves post-photography, but they're more like pre-something else. So the notion, you know, I think to Alex's point, you know, we exist in this kind of technology stack where we're so removed from the core ones and zeros of the technology that the same thing exists in photography, where there's so much processing that happens, you know, with our phone. You know, this is a tiny computer, that the notion that this is taking a photo is a complete fiction. And so there's this notion of, I think, both with GANs and AI, that the computer builds a model of something, and then we use that model to create something. But you know, with GANs, with GANs, when I train it, I'm training it not on flowers or not on natural scenes. I'm training it on photos of flowers. I'm training it on photos of natural scenes. And so I'm working with this Dark Taxa group, which is, you know, people in Germany and England and other European countries, to sort of disassemble what a camera actually means, and then sort of within that intervention, begin to add some new types of machine learning into that system. And so it's still a work in process. It's almost like developing a new type of camera, but I'm having a lot of fun, you know, not just talking with artists working with AI, but also artists that are exploring what the next thing beyond photography is going to be.
Oh, that's exciting and sort of mysterious. Yeah. So I want to learn more. Always excited to see where that goes. Alex.
Yeah, so I mean, the quarantine this year sort of drove me further away from interactive things, more to coding, which led to putting out the Chow series of generative artworks that have the source code, which is part of the show you curated, Jason, at the Kate Bass Gallery, which everyone should check out. Yeah, I believe that might be coming to Super Rare. We'll see. Yeah, I've been working a lot lately with text generation and trying to connect text generation to visual things. That's kind of in stealth mode right now, but there's been some interesting outputs. Yeah, that I think is going to lead to this sort of new type of human machine learning collaboration where there's a big creative cycle where creativity is coming from these massive data sets in a way that the visual aspects are actually left up to the artist instead of the GAN creating it. But the sort of conceptual ideas are being come up with the machine, which is kind of backwards of how I've been working, and I think a lot of other people have. So that's pretty exciting to me, and yeah, I think there'll be some cool stuff from that.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to following progress from all three of you, and I know we all kind of keep in communication email-wise, and hopefully there'll be some other opportunities for cool shows and stuff like that. And I'm a pretty regular Super Rare visitor and collector and writer, so I look forward to seeing your work in Super Rare as well. And hopefully this panel gave some folks, both in Super Rare and other places, some insight into your work, because I personally do believe it is important to get to know the artists and how they think about their work and to kind of see the full breadth of their work. So I appreciate you all sharing your time for the panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, guys.
It was fun. Thank you.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah, it was
Glad
fun.
you guys had fun. Yeah, take care.
Bye.
Bye now.